Welcome back to another short video about my top 10 players and matchups to avoid for the upcoming week. Week 17 is here. The fantasy football playoffs championships are here. It's time to make the right start decisions. I will be your guide to tell you about players to avoid, matchups to avoid, my top 10 list. Again, I am Andrew Erickson from Pro Football Focus, here to break it all down with you so that you are set to emerge victorious as a champion after the weekend concludes. Ryan Tannehill. So we got his number one wide receiver back last Thursday night, but it still wasn't enough for him to be a worthwhile fantasy quarterback. He finished outside the top 15 fantasy quarterbacks for the sixth time in his last 7 games in week 16. So the fantasy ceiling just has not been present for Tannehill all year long in a passing game that's just starving for weapons, and things don't look great for him in week 17 against a red-hot Miami Dolphins defense. Miami ranks first in the fewest fantasy points allowed per game to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks, and no quarterback has scored more than 18 fantasy points against them dating back to week 8. Tannehill needs to be avoided in all one quarterback formats and viewed as a fringe QB2 in Superflex leagues. Next up, Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan can't score more than 13 fantasy points against the Detroit Lions of all teams. Then there's no hope for him against a Buffalo Bills defense that ranks number 1 in the fewest fantasy points per game allowed to quarterbacks this season. Ryan hasn't scored more than 13 fantasy points in a game dating back all the way to week 9, and he's thrown for just 215 yards just twice in his last 7 games. Needless to say, smash the under on Ryan's 215.5 passing yards prop on prizepicks.com. Just 2 quarterbacks have hit over that number against the Bills in their last 9 games played. Next up, shifting to the running back position, Josh Jacobs. Josh Jacobs is fresh off a season-high 129 rushing yards in the team's victory over the Denver Broncos. But it was an underwhelming day for him in fantasy because he didn't even score. Jacobs also just caught 1 pass for -5 yards despite running a route on 58% of Derek Carr's dropbacks. The Raiders running back ranks 3rd in route participation over the last 4 weeks, so we should expect to see his targets and receptions climb back up. It'll be critical that Jacobs sees heavy usage as a receiver because the Colts are allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. The difficult matchup moves Jacobs outside the top 12 running back rankings, even with positive game script potentially working in his favor, with the Colts using a backup quarterback under center with Carson Wentz placed on the COVID list. Next up, Michael Carter for the New York Jets. So after seeing somewhat of a limited role in his first game off injured reserve, Michael Carter reclaimed RB1 status in the Jets backfield. He and Tevin Coleman split carries nearly 50-50, 16 versus 14, but Carter saw the superior usage as a receiver. He ran around 62% of Zach Wilson dropbacks, a 20% increase from week 15. His receiving work will be his only path to fantasy success in week 17 when Gang Green takes on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The reigning Super Bowl champions rank 1st in fewest rushing yards allowed to running backs, but ranked 2nd in targets and receptions allowed to running backs this season. So although the matchup suggests Carter should see some decent volume in the passing game, Zach Wilson has not been targeting the running back position like his counterpart, Captain Checkdown, Mike White. Carter has yet to see more than 3 targets in 7 games with Wilson under center. D'Onta Foreman, Tennessee Titans. I echoed my sentiment to sit D'Onta Foreman on this show last week in week 16 to the chagrin of many. I was ultimately proven correct, though, in my analysis because the Tennessee Titans running back finished outside the top 35 despite scoring a rushing touchdown. The Titans' backfield remains extremely muddied between Foreman, who had a 34% snap share and 9 touches last week, McNichols, 42% snap share, 7 touches, Dontrell Hilliard, 21% snap share, 7 touches, making it impossible to trust any of them, especially in bad matchups. That's exactly how it looks to play out in week 17, as Miami's defense has allowed the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to running backs over the last 4 weeks and 3rd fewest points per game on the season. Myles Gaskin. Because there's a changing of the guard in Miami. Duke Johnson, Philip Lindsay, led the backfield in Week 16, handling 26 of 29 running back carries, while Myles Gaskin saw 3 measly carries against the New Orleans Saints on Monday Night Football. The former starter did see the most work in the passing game, which seems to kind of be his new role on offense. But either way, the Dolphins' backfield has become a gross 3-way committee that you should want zero part of in your fantasy championships, especially against the Tennessee Titans. They've allowed the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs this season and over the last 4 weeks, dethroning the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Saints as the defense you never want to play running backs against. Rex Burkhead for the Houston Texans. Yes, Sexy Rexy is on the players to avoid because even though the Texans have no problem feeding Burkhead when David Johnson is inactive, we saw last week he handled 22 carries, including 3 from inside the 5-yard line for 149 rushing yards against a horrible and COVID-stricken Los Angeles Chargers run defense. But the Week 16 game script played heavily in his favor, so don't go crazy jamming it into starting lineups. If and only if Johnson is out another week, he was placed on the COVID reserve list on Monday, Burkhead can be a flex-worthy asset come fantasy championship weekend, albeit in a tough matchup against the 49ers. San Francisco represents the 3rd most difficult matchup per PFF's strength of schedule tool because they've not allowed a running back to rush for more than 60 yards since Week 9. So it's a tough matchup for Sexy Rexy. Michael Pittman Jr. So he's the key cog to the Colts passing attack. The second-year wide receiver ranks 3rd in percentage of routes run per dropback and owns a league-leading 39% target share over his last 4 games. His target share has increased by 21% from weeks 9 through 12, the highest of any player. But the issue is, the Colts aren't going to throw much without Carson Wentz under center. I mean, they were barely throwing with Carson Wentz under center. Rookie Sam Ehlinger is slated to get the start, and his best asset to offer for the Colts on offense is his dynamism as a rushing threat. And the matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders, 3rd most fantasy points allowed to running backs versus 3rd fewest fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, clearly portrays that we are in for a Jonathan Taylor 30-plus touch fest and not a Pittman double-digit target game. Terry McLaurin, mentioned him last week as well, and he particularly busted in a terrible matchup against stud cornerback Trayvon Diggs. Fantasy football managers cannot trust this boom or bust wide receiver in starting lineups for Week 17 that has been much more bust than boom really over the last month, 6 weeks. The Ohio State product has 4 top 7 finishes this season and 11 outside the top 35 this year. His target share has dipped from 23% to 14% over the last 4 weeks, so it can't even be relied upon as a safe bet for volume. In fact, in the matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, 2nd fewest fantasy points allowed per game and receiving yards allowed per game to wide receivers this season, McLaurin becomes 100% hands-off for championship weekend. The only action item worth taking on TMC is locking him onto your bench and taking the under at 53.5 receiving yards on his prop. Again, he's only hit that mark in 1 of his last 6 games. Woof. And last but not least, Marvin Jones Jr. with a tough matchup against the New England Patriots. He has surpassed 45.5 receiving yards in just 3 of his last 9 games played, and there's a common theme when he's been able to accomplish that feat. It's been against weak secondaries like the New York Jets, San Francisco 49ers, and Tennessee Titans. That couldn't be farther from the case in Week 17 versus the Pats, who have allowed the 4th fewest receiving yards and fewest receptions per game to opposing wide receivers this season. And you could argue, I will, Jones is not even the number 1 wide receiver on his own team, as Laquan Treadwell leads the Jacksonville Jaguars in routes run and receiving yards over the last 2 weeks. But Jones will likely get the wide receiver 1 treatment from New England's defense by drawing coverage from stud cornerback J.C. Jackson. The Pats' number 1 corner has allowed the league's 2nd lowest passer rating when targeted this season, 47.5. Don't chase production from last week from Jones and instead pound the under on his 45.5 receiving yards prop. So there you have it, folks. Those are my top 10 players and matchups to avoid for Week 17 Fantasy Football Champions. Good luck to everybody. And again, my name is Andrew Erickson. You can find all of my work over at ProFootballFocus.com. And good luck to everyone on Championship Weekend.